There's a specific moment inside every avoidant person's psychology that arrives later than almost anyone expects, sometimes months after the breakup, sometimes years, sometimes only after watching, from a careful distance, that you've genuinely built a life that no longer includes any space reserved for them. It's the moment the fantasy finally collapses. Because for as long as an avoidant partner can maintain even the faintest possibility that you might eventually return, some part of their psychology remains protected from having to fully process what actually happened. The door doesn't have to be completely closed. Some sliver of possibility, however small, however unrealistic, functions like a psychological safety net, allowing them to avoid confronting the full weight of a loss they were never actually equipped to process the way people with different attachment styles process loss. Today, we're walking through exactly what happens inside an avoidant person's mind when that final door genuinely, permanently closes. When the fantasy of eventual return becomes undeniable in its impossibility, and they're forced, for perhaps the first time in their entire adult life, to sit with a loss they have no learned mechanism for processing in a healthy way. Let's start with something crucial to understand about how avoidant attachment actually functions during and after a breakup, because it explains why this realization arrives so much later and hits so much differently than it would for someone with a different attachment style entirely. When a relationship ends, most people experience grief in a relatively linear, if painful, way. There's acute sadness, processing, gradual acceptance, and eventually a genuine emotional integration of the loss that allows them to move forward while still honoring what the relationship meant. Avoidant attachment disrupts this process almost completely, not because avoidant people don't experience loss, but because their entire psychological architecture is built specifically to prevent full, immediate emotional processing of exactly this kind of vulnerability. Remember what avoidant attachment actually is at its core: a nervous system trained, usually from very early childhood, to associate emotional need with danger, to equate vulnerability with the risk of abandonment or engulfment, and to protect against this risk through premature self-sufficiency and emotional distance. This training doesn't pause conveniently just because a breakup has occurred. If anything, breakups activate this protective system more intensely than almost any other relational experience, because a breakup represents exactly the kind of loss the avoidant nervous system has spent an entire lifetime trying to prevent from ever mattering too much in the first place. This is why, in the immediate aftermath of ending things with you, an avoidant partner often appears to be handling the separation with startling, almost unsettling ease. This isn't performance, at least not consciously. It's the direct result of a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do: minimizing the emotional significance of the loss, redirecting attention towards self-sufficiency and independence, constructing a narrative where the relationship's ending feels manageable, even necessary, rather than devastating. But here's what almost nobody explains clearly enough about this apparent ease, and it's crucial to understanding everything that comes later. This isn't actually genuine emotional resolution. It's postponement, dressed up convincingly enough to fool both the people watching from outside and, quite often, the avoidant person themselves. The grief hasn't been processed. It's been deferred, pushed into a kind of psychological storage that avoidant attachment specializes in creating, waiting for a moment when it can no longer be successfully avoided. This deferred grief remains manageable, even indefinitely, as long as one specific condition remains intact. The belief, however unconscious, however rarely consciously articulated, that the relationship's ending isn't necessarily final. As long as some part of an avoidant person's mind can maintain the possibility of eventual reconciliation, however unlikely they might rationally understand that possibility to be, the full weight of permanent loss never actually has to be confronted directly. This is precisely why avoidant partners so often maintain a strange kind of low-grade contact after a breakup, even when they've been the ones to initiate the ending. The occasional text that seems to serve no real purpose. The social media engagement that feels inconsistent with someone who's supposedly moved on completely. The casual mention to mutual friends, seemingly offhand, checking whether you're doing okay. All of this behavior serves the same underlying psychological function, maintaining just enough connection to preserve the fantasy that permanent separation hasn't actually occurred, that the door remains open, even if neither party is actively walking through it right now. This is also precisely why, if you've ever tried to maintain a careful, measured friendship with an avoidant ex, hoping this arrangement might eventually evolve into something more, you may have unknowingly been participating in exactly the mechanism that prevents them from ever having to fully process what losing you actually means. Your continued presence, even in a diminished, redefined form, allows their psychological system to keep deferring the reckoning indefinitely, sometimes for years, without ever requiring genuine confrontation with what full, permanent loss would actually feel like. This is why the moment we're discussing today, the moment an avoidant person finally realizes you're genuinely, permanently not coming back, almost never arrives through a single dramatic conversation, a definitive announcement, or any clear, singular moment of realization. It arrives, instead, through a gradual accumulation of evidence that becomes impossible to reframe or explain away any longer. Evidence that finally, completely closes the psychological space where their deferred grief has been safely, indefinitely stored. What does this accumulating evidence actually look like? It looks like discovering, through whatever indirect channels remain available, that you've entered a genuinely serious new relationship, one that doesn't carry the markers of rebound or temporary distraction that might allow their psychological system to maintain some lingering hope. It looks like realizing that your responses, on the rare occasions you still interact at all, have become genuinely, unmistakably neutral rather than carrying any of the emotional charge that used to suggest lingering attachment, positive or negative. It looks like watching, from whatever distance they've maintained, as you build an entire life, entire routines, entire sources of meaning and joy that clearly no longer include any space reserved for their eventual return. This accumulation eventually reaches a threshold where the fantasy simply can no longer be sustained, regardless of how sophisticated the avoidant psychological system has become at deferring exactly this kind of confrontation. And when that threshold is finally reached, what happens next reveals something genuinely significant about avoidant psychology that most people never fully understand, precisely because they never witness it directly, given how thoroughly avoidant people typically process this realization in complete isolation, far from anyone who might actually see what's happening underneath their carefully maintained. What happens next, once this threshold is genuinely reached, rarely looks anything like the dramatic emotional breakdown popular culture often imagines when picturing someone finally realizing they've lost someone permanently. Avoidant psychology doesn't suddenly transform into a different attachment style simply because circumstances have finally forced a confrontation with reality. The same defensive architecture that prevented immediate processing throughout the deferral period remains largely intact, which means this realization tends to unfold through a much quieter, much more internally contained process than most people would expect. The first response, once the fantasy of eventual return becomes genuinely unsustainable, typically involves something that looks, paradoxically, like increased busyness or increased achievement focus, rather than any visible emotional processing at all. This isn't coincidental. For someone whose entire psychological structure is built around avoiding direct emotional confrontation, external productivity becomes one of the most reliable, available strategies for managing internal distress that has nowhere else sanctioned to go. You might notice, if you're still receiving any indirect information about their life, a sudden intensification of career focus, a new fitness regimen pursued with unusual intensity, a flurry of new projects or goals that seem to emerge specifically during this period. This isn't simply moving on in any healthy sense. It's redirection, a way of channeling genuine internal distress into activities that provide structure, achievement, and a sense of control, precisely because the alternative, sitting directly with the grief itself, remains something their nervous system has never developed adequate tools to handle safely. Understanding this pattern helps explain something that often confuses people who witness an avoidant X seemingly thriving during exactly the period when genuine grief should theoretically be at its most intense. The thriving isn't necessarily evidence that the loss doesn't matter. It's frequently evidence of exactly the opposite, channeled through the only mechanism their psychology has ever learned to trust. Beneath this external productivity, though, something genuinely significant is happening internally, even if it rarely produces the kind of visible emotional expression you might expect or even hope to eventually witness. This is where avoidant psychology reveals something crucial about how deferred grief actually processes once deferral is no longer possible. It tends to surface not through direct emotional experience, but through a kind of retrospective reconstruction, a private, often obsessive re-examination of the relationship that happens entirely internally, rarely shared with anyone, sometimes not even fully acknowledged by the avoidant person themselves. This reconstruction often involves, finally, for the first time, genuinely processing memories and moments that were too threatening to fully engage with while the relationship was still active, or while the fantasy of return remained available as psychological protection. This might mean finally sitting with specific moments of genuine connection that occurred throughout the relationship, moments that previously felt too vulnerable to fully acknowledge, now revisited with a clarity that wasn't accessible before, precisely because the protective mechanisms that once prevented this clarity have finally, genuinely collapsed. This retrospective processing often produces something that looks, from the outside, like sudden nostalgia or sudden appreciation, appearing months or sometimes years after the relationship actually ended, disconnected in timing from anything that would make sense according to typical grief patterns. This is precisely why so many people report the unsettling experience of an avoidant ex reaching out, seemingly out of nowhere, long after any reasonable expectation of contact has passed, expressing appreciation or reflection that feels genuinely different in quality from anything offered during the relationship itself or its immediate aftermath. Here's what's crucial to understand about this delayed reflection, though, because it directly addresses a question that likely matters enormously if you're currently on the receiving end of exactly this kind of unexpected, delayed contact. This genuine internal processing, however real it might be, doesn't automatically translate into someone who has actually developed the capacity for the kind of sustained intimacy that originally proved impossible for them to offer. Understanding your own worth in retrospect, appreciating what was lost only once losing it became irreversible, represents real psychological movement, but it's a fundamentally different achievement than developing genuine capacity for present, ongoing vulnerability within an actual relationship. This distinction matters enormously because it's precisely where so many people get pulled back into painful, repetitive cycles with avoidant exes who reach out during this exact phase of delayed processing. The appreciation feels genuine because it typically is genuine, but genuine appreciation for what was lost doesn't necessarily indicate genuine readiness to build something different this time, particularly if the reaching out happens precisely because you've become permanently unavailable, activating exactly the kind of longing that avoidant psychology tends to experience most intensely toward exactly the things it cannot actually have. This creates one of the most painful ironies embedded in avoidant attachment. one worth understanding clearly if you're navigating this exact situation. The moment an avoidant person finally develops genuine appreciation, genuine longing, sometimes even genuine insight into their own patterns and how those patterns contributed to the relationship's ending, often coincides precisely with the moment when reconciliation has become genuinely, permanently impossible. This isn't a cruel coincidence. It's a direct consequence of how avoidant psychology actually functions, because genuine longing for someone with this attachment style frequently requires the safety of impossibility in order to develop at all. Wanting something you can actually have activates the same threat response that caused the original withdrawal. Wanting something that's already permanently lost feels safer precisely because it can never actually require the vulnerability that made the relationship untenable to begin with. Understanding this pattern is essential for anyone who might currently be receiving this kind of delayed, seemingly genuine reflection from an avoidant ex, because it directly addresses the question you're probably asking yourself. Does this mean they've finally changed? Does this mean, if given another chance, they might actually be capable of the relationship I always needed? The honest answer, one that requires resisting the pull of hope this delayed vulnerability naturally creates, is that genuine change requires something this particular process rarely provides: the opportunity to practice new patterns within an actual, present relationship, rather than simply developing insight about a relationship that no longer exists and cannot be tested in real time. Insight without practice, however genuine the insight might be, doesn't automatically translate into different behavior the next time genuine intimacy and its accompanying vulnerability become available again. This brings us to what ultimately matters most about this entire process. Not what happens inside the avoidant person once they realize you're genuinely not coming back, as psychologically significant and worth understanding as that process actually is, but what this realization ultimately means for you and what you deserve to understand clearly about your own position in this dynamic, regardless of what internal transformation might or might not be genuinely unfolding on their side of this permanent separation. Ned exterior. Because here's what matters most, ultimately, and it has almost nothing to do with whatever internal reckoning is or isn't happening on their side of this permanent closure. Your worth was never actually contingent on whether an avoidant partner eventually developed the capacity to fully appreciate you. This truth deserves to be stated as directly and completely as possible, because so much of what we've discussed today can easily be misread as a kind of vindication narrative, proof, finally, that they really did love you, that the depth was real, that your instincts about the connection weren't wrong after all. And while all of that might be genuinely true, none of it should become the foundation you build your own healing upon. Because here's the trap waiting inside this entire understanding, one worth naming directly. If your sense of peace depends on eventually learning that they suffered appropriately, that they finally recognized what they lost, that their belated grief somehow validates everything you experienced throughout the relationship, you remain just as tethered to their internal process as you were when you were actively hoping for their return. Real freedom from this dynamic requires something more complete than simply understanding why they behave the way they do. It requires releasing your own healing from any dependency on their eventual realization at all, whether that realization ever arrives, whether it arrives in the form and timeline you might hope for, whether it produces anything resembling the acknowledgement you may have spent months or years quietly wishing you could witness. This is worth sitting with, honestly, because there's a particular kind of hope embedded in everything we've discussed today, one that deserves direct examination rather than being allowed to operate unconsciously in the background of your own healing process. Understanding that an avoidant person eventually, genuinely grieves losing you. Understanding that their productivity and busyness often mask real internal reckoning. Understanding that delayed appreciation, frequently does reflect something authentic rather than performed. All of this knowledge can easily become another version of waiting, simply relocated from waiting for their return to waiting for their proper recognition of what they lost. But you don't actually need either of these things in order to build a genuinely whole life moving forward. Their eventual grief, however real, belongs entirely to their own psychological journey, one that exists completely independent of your continued attention or need for confirmation. Their delayed insight into their own patterns, however genuine, doesn't require your witness in order to be valid, and more importantly, doesn't require your continued availability in order for you to have already received everything you actually needed from this entire experience. Clarity about what happened, understanding about why it happened the way it did, and permission to finally completely release yourself from any remaining obligation to manage, wait for, or hope for their eventual emotional catching up. This is precisely where the deepest and most important truth of this entire conversation finally reveals itself. The question was never really about whether an avoidant partner eventually realizes you're not coming back. That realization, whenever and however it eventually arrives, was never actually the thing standing between you and genuine peace. What actually stands between you and genuine peace is your own continued investment in an outcome that exists entirely outside your control, an investment that keeps you tethered to their psychological process long after you've physically, practically moved on with your own life. So if you're currently in the position of watching, even from a careful, protected distance, for signs that an avoidant ex has finally realized what they lost, understand exactly what you're actually doing. You're still waiting, not for their return this time perhaps, but for their reckoning, their grief, their proper acknowledgement of your worth. And this waiting, however different it might feel from the earlier hope of reconciliation, still keeps a part of you oriented around their internal experience rather than fully, completely oriented around your own. Real closure was never actually going to come from watching them finally understand what they lost. It was always going to come from you, finally, completely understanding what you deserved, independent of whether they ever caught up to that same understanding themselves. This is what actually happens in the end that matters most. Not the moment an avoidant person finally realizes you're never coming back, however psychologically significant that moment genuinely is for them, but the moment you finally completely stop needing that realization in order to feel whole yourself. That moment belongs entirely to you. It doesn't require their timeline, their insight, their eventual grief, or their delayed appreciation in order to arrive. It simply requires you to finally, fully choose yourself, regardless of whatever internal process continues unfolding on the other side of a door that's already permanently closed. They may spend months or years slowly, privately, reckoning with a loss they were never equipped to process the way you needed them to process it while you were still there to witness it directly. But you don't have to wait around to see how that reckoning eventually unfolds. You already have everything you actually need, not their realization, your own.